Friday transportation seminar at Portland State University. I'm Chris Monsignor. I'm a faculty member in civil and environmental engineering, and with my co-host, Dr. Lightning Wong from Wang from Urban Studies and Planning, we co-organize and teach the class for the seminar. So today we're very pleased to have William Peterson, the CEO and co-founder of Lab Report, talking to us about how to make micromobility work. So.
Thank you. So does anybody not know what micromobility means? It's not even a word that, yeah. So really it just means when we used to talk about bikes, we just talk about bikes, and now there's like scooters, and then there's three-wheeled scooters, and then there's like maybe four-wheeled scooters, and then there's things that are kind of halfway between scooters and bikes. Basically, there's a lot of new types of bike-like vehicles that are all trying to do similar jobs to what a bike does for us, right? So it's like this small vehicle, it may or may not have an electric motor, and it gets you places on a relatively short journey, maybe like 1 to 5 miles. And then you can park it on the sidewalk and you can ride it in the bike lane. So anything that sort of loosely corresponds to that description is micromobility. And we have to have a word for it because otherwise it would get really confusing. So we're talking about making micromobility work. And what we really mean when we talk about it is we're talking about shared micromobility. So not just bikes that people own, but the shared fleets of vehicles that are being offered increasingly by private companies, where you can use an app or a credit card or something like that to rent for one trip. So it all started with Bikeshare, of course, and back in 2017, Bikeshare looked really different than it does today. So just to take you through a trip on memory bike lane, this was before micromobility was a thing. We had services like City Bike, which in this country is probably one of the most successful bike share programs ever. Even today, I think it's probably one of the biggest fleets and does more trips than probably any other system. But there's a couple of things that were really different about it. One is that it was dock-based. So you had to go to a dock to start your trip, and if you wanted to end the trip somewhere, you needed to find a dock and hope that there was a space available for you to sort of park the thing. And then the bikes themselves were really just not a whole lot different from what you might buy at a bike shop. They were a little bit more like heavy duty and a little bit more adjustable, but there wasn't like anything electronic on them. They didn't have a battery, they didn't have a motor. And so it was sort of the smart dock, dumb bike model. And then we had, so Bitetown, which is the system we all know and love in Portland, did this interesting thing where they kind of flipped it and they said, well, what if we had smart bikes and dumb docks? So now the docks are really just glorified staples, and the bikes have GPS and they have a little computer in them. So we were talking about Biketown, which is like this cool historical anecdote at this point because it sort of represented the transition from dock-based systems like City Bike to what we have now, which is the so-called dockless bikes and scooters. And then there are also systems that didn't make it. So Pronto is one example here of a system in Seattle that sadly no longer exists. So then the data for Bikeshare was also really different. Thank you. All right, so Bikeshare data back, or just bike data, micromobility data, if you will, back in 2017, this was kind of the state of the art. So I think this is on the Hawthorne Bridge, maybe, one of the bridges. You ride over a little hose, and it counts you. And that way, planners have data on how many people are crossing the bridge, which is pretty cool, but it's also pretty rudimentary. You don't know much about where this person is going, or where they came from, or which routes that they traveled on, nothing like that. So systems like City Bike did actually publish data. They published CSV files, but because it was sort of a smart dock, dumb bike model, you didn't actually know where people were biking. You just knew where they started and ended their trips. So this data you can still get. It's pretty cool. It's all publicly available. And one of the little side notes here is that this data is sort of just on the boundary of what you might consider to be personally identifiable information. So because these stations are the beginnings and ends of the trips, it's a little bit more anonymous than, say, a trip that starts at your house and goes directly to your workplace. And so cities have been able to publish this data, and I do think in some cases researchers have been able to de-anonymize it, but by and large, it's been okay to have this data out there on the internet. So you can go and get all the data for all of these trips in a pseudo-anonymous format right now. And then lastly, you have app data. And app data, there's an app near and dear to my heart, which is the Ride app, which is one of the first products my company made. So before we had smart scooters and smart bikes, we were relying on apps like Ride and like the Strava app and other apps to get route data so that researchers could start to see, what are the trips people are taking, actually, what do they actually look like? And so this was really, really rich data. The problem was you got to get somebody to install an app, and they've got to, in the case of Strava, they got to remember to run it. Ride app was automatic, but still, your sample size was relatively small, and there was sampling bias with this. So it had its drawbacks as well. And then the heavens opened and rained down the scooters. I don't think anybody was expecting scooters to be the next big thing. Certainly I wasn't. I was looking at what was going on with Bikeshare in China, and I certainly thought that there was something interesting about it that could apply in this country. One of the things that got me most excited about Bikeshare in China is that you had cities that went from 2 to 3% mode share by bike to 20% in 2 or 3 years. And that's astounding. That's Portland has taken, 30 years to get to 7%. So that got me really excited, just as someone who wants to see new systems and options of transportation flourish. But scooters were not at all on my radar. And so I think it's fair to say that scooter share is going well. It's exceeded anyone's expectations in terms of the scale of its success, but there's also been a lot of issues, right? And so this is just sort of a random sampling of some of the headlines we've seen. So there's all of these issues around safety, around equity, around the fact that there's not really in a lot of cities a clear space for these scooters to exist, right? Do you ride them in the bike lane? What if there is no bike lane? You probably ride them on the sidewalk. Do you park them on the sidewalk? What if there's not a lot of room for it on the sidewalk? Do you park it in the street? And so it's caused some really big scaling challenges because, I think primarily because it's just grown so quickly that cities are really trying to figure out what's the right playbook to manage this, but also to allow it to succeed because it has such potential to deliver mode shifts that we all are interested in seeing. And so I like to sort of take a step back and think about it from the angle of the different entities that are involved, right? Because they have very different perspectives that they think about. So cities are really concerned about losing control of the right-of-way. They don't want someone to get hurt. They also are really concerned about what happened in the days of ride-hailing. So if you recall, Uber and Lyft came to Portland, launched without permission, didn't really share any data with the cities. The cities didn't know what was going on. And to this day, cities don't really have a lot of control over what's going on with ride-hailing. And so even though we're starting to see data that's indicating that ride-hailing is contributing to congestion and making things worse, and there's safety problems with pickups and drop-offs, cities just don't have a lot of recourse when it comes to making or enforcing regulations around ride-hailing. So, gosh, I lost my train of thought when we got into the submarine.
We were just on the cities.
Thanks. So cities are really worried about what happened in ride-hailing, I think is safe to say. And it's one of the ways that they see this space is, this is an opportunity to get it right, to have, good systems of control, to have a more collaborative relationship with the companies that are doing business on their streets, and hopefully to deliver better outcomes for the city. So you don't want to have, a new form of transportation that in 5 years at scale is causing all these new problems. And then operators, it's been interesting because a lot of the operators that we've worked with, they're actually trying their hardest to do the right thing, or at least to do what they think is the right thing, to follow regulations, to comply. Sometimes they feel like cities just don't understand how their business works as a technology company, or how they have to make money in order to keep providing the service. And sometimes they feel like they're not being listened to. So there's a lot of sort of stuff that gets lost or gained in translation between cities and private tech companies that are offering these services. And then you have citizens, and honestly, I feel like citizens, have the most important voice at the end of the day. And a lot of them are just like, hey, just give me this scooter. I just want people to ride it. It's not enough. And then alternatively, they might say, hey, get this thing out of the way. It's blocking the sidewalk, or it's, it's in the bike lane and it shouldn't be, or it's in the road and it shouldn't be. So I like to think about it from these different perspectives, just because it helps inform a lot of the sort of disagreements and problems that you can see when we start having these services land in our city. But then I also like to zoom out a bit and just remember that we all want micromobility to succeed. I see this as an opportunity that cities, it's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity that cities have to harness a whole bunch of money, a whole bunch of innovative new vehicle types, and a whole bunch of new people to collaborate on getting out of this, right? So we need this to succeed. So despite the fact that each of these three entities have these different concerns, they all want the same thing at the end of the day. So I like to reframe a little bit the concerns around needs. What do cities need? Well, they need to provide transportation options to business elsewhere. Citizens need those needs and build them into a pyramid. This is kind of a pyramid that represents how cities are thinking about managing micromobility. So at the bottom, first you need to have measurable goals, right? So is so key in this space is because it's moving so quickly, and it's getting to such a large scale that these foundational needs for the city are not going to be met unless you have data, ideally real-time data, that you can use to inform how it's going. So I think it's really important that cities are not just relying on the old things like hose counters that they had before, but they have access to really rich data so that they can evaluate whether these goals are being met. And then on top of the data, you have the actual regulations that say, here's what you can and can't do, here's where you can and can't be, here's how many vehicles, etc. And then you have the fees, right? And fees play a powerful role in regulating and also in making sure that this whole system is sustainable for cities as well. And finally, when you have all of these things working together, you get the top of the pyramid, which is a proliferation of scooters and micromobility services that we all want to succeed. So I'm just going to go through each of these sort of components, but I like to lay them out this way so that you can sort of see that the city's goals are foundational, and then you have this really key need for data on top of it, and then the regulations and fees are all sort of structured around what's possible with that data. So when you're defining goals, I mentioned that you want to make goals that are measurable. You want to have them be explicitly defined, and you want them to be enforceable in some way. So I think Portland actually did a really great job defining its goals. They're right up front in the micromobility permit program that they put together. They have 4 goals: reduce traffic congestion, prevent fatalities and serious injuries, expand access to underserved Portlanders, and then reduce air pollution, including climate pollution. So those are really well-defined goals. Each of them is measurable, and anytime there's a disagreement between the different constituents I mentioned, the city can go back to the goals and say, look, these are the goals that we outlined in the program, so we need to be making progress on those goals. And then conversely, if there's a disagreement that really isn't about these goals, that can be a valuable conversation as well. So equity is sort of a cornerstone in that pyramid that I presented. And I think there's a lot of different ways that cities are thinking about this. Primary is distribution, right? So we want to make sure that these systems are not just in the sort of wealthiest and densest parts of town, but that they are actually going into neighborhoods that didn't have Bikeshare before. And one of the things that's really cool is in Portland, there's actually a much larger fleet of micromobility vehicles now than we had when it was just Biketown, and it's serving a much wider area than it was when it was just Biketown. So that's really exciting to see. And Portland has gone a little bit further and actually created some incentives that we'll talk about to make sure that those vehicles are being distributed in a way that's equitable. Another common thing we see is that there's low-income fares or even like special passes that low-income residents can get access to. So that's a great way to ensure that even though the companies have a pricing model that's sort of geared around one size fits all, that cities can come in and say, well, we need to make sure that it works for everyone. And then adaptive hardware is another one that I think Portland has taken a leadership stance on. Portland actually created some incentives for scooters that had seats in its current micromobility program. So if you had a fleet with seats in it, you would actually get some extra points during the permitting process, and that's why we've seen a couple of companies who've been able to roll out seated scooters, which, just side note, my favorite scooters are the ones with seats. I feel more comfortable on them, even though I don't have a physical disability. So I think it's one of these things where not only is it helping with equity, but it's also helping just create better services overall. So equity is obviously a really complicated topic, and it's not always one that operators or even sometimes cities do a great job of managing. So I think at the end of the day, it's important that both cities and operators are reaching out to communities to find out and make sure that these services are actually working for them. So some of the concerns I mentioned are easy to see from sort of a top-down perspective. That if the scooters aren't in that neighborhood, no one's going to be able to ride them. But what you might not know is that there might be other barriers that prevent people from riding them, right? So does the app exist in a language that works for that neighborhood would be one example. And are people actually familiar enough with how to use the service? Do you need to come in and do some training or some workshops with that community? So it's not just about having sort of these top-down, data-driven approaches. It's also about having relationships with the communities that you're hoping to serve. So this is just a little example back in the days of Bikeshare, where I think the city of San Francisco was trying to roll out Bikeshare in a neighborhood, and they actually got a lot of backlash from that because the community didn't see it as a service for them. They saw it as a threat. So safety is the other cornerstone for micromobility. Every city cares about safety. A lot of cities have goals around Vision Zero, including Portland. And I think the overall data that we've seen so far is that scooters are very safe. They're roughly in the same sort of territory in terms of the number of deaths and serious crashes as bikes, right? So we definitely have enough data at this point that we can say it's not going to be, like vaping or whatever, where there's this sudden, rash of really serious incidents. On the other hand, it represents some new challenges as well. And so cities are still trying to figure out what that looks like, both for the users of the system, i.e. the people riding them, and also for the people who are not riding them. For example, there might be concerns in many cases around like scooters blocking the sidewalk in a way that creates safety hazards, or collisions between people walking on the sidewalks and people who are riding scooters on the sidewalks. So we are seeing some new types of issues. This magnitude of the issues is similar to what we had before with just bikes, but there's some new ones as well. And so I think that it's really important that cities have reporting requirements for crashes and safety incidents in their permitting programs, just so that we can get data about these new types of safety issues, because it is really early, but it's growing really quickly. And then I also think it's important that cities sort of have that data so that they can avoid getting into reactive cycles where there's a bad headline or like a publicized event that is just kind of sensational and doesn't actually represent a rigorous way to think about safety. So we need to have context so that we can move beyond those headlines and regulate in a way that's appropriate. And the only way we're going to do that is with access to data. Side note here, I think it's really interesting, the data coming out of New Zealand. New Zealand has a really different set of regulations around insurance that basically result in much richer data on every single crash. So if you want to see some interesting data, early data on the safety of scooters and electric bikes, New Zealand's one of the best sources right now. So let's talk about data. It's the sort of next rung up on the pyramid. And obviously, it's really important to what we do. Ride Report's role is really about providing high quality data to cities, data that they can trust. So the first thing is, every city at this point should be using the MDS open standard. It's clearly far and away the most common, best supported, and best developed standard that's out there. In the early days, cities were kind of using different standards or coming up with their own data format altogether. And then, of course, some companies were proposing proprietary formats. And I think at this point, cities are just not going to get consistent and high quality data if they're using something other than MDS. So luckily, we have this standard. It's open source. It was developed by cities, including the city of LA, and I think Portland is now involved in the development of this standard. However, it's not enough to just use the standard. You have to actually make sure that the data flowing through that standard is accurate and that it's trustworthy. And this is a big one because, in the past, cities have, gotten data that was misleading or in some cases even intentionally inaccurate. So cities need to make sure that they have data they can trust. One of the services we provide to cities, and cities can certainly do this on their own as well, is just auditing the data. So making sure that it's complete, technically accurate, and that it reflects the on-the-ground conditions. And so we look at things like, are the data feeds reporting on 100% of the vehicles? And are those vehicles in the places that we expect them to be? And are they in the states that we expect them to be? And then everything in MDS is sort of driven by real-time events coming into the system. So we need to make sure that those events are being delivered in a timely manner. The last thing I'll say is that this data, unlike maybe the data that City Bike was providing, those station-to-station trip data, this is full GPS data. So it's really not any different than the data collected by, say, Strava or the Ride app. It describes trips that a lot of times go directly from someone's house to their destination. And I think the best way to think about this data is that it is PII. It doesn't say your name. It doesn't say anything about you per se, but there's been a lot of research in this area. And if you have precise location data or even truncated location data or fuzzed location data, it's pretty trivial to de-anonymize. So I think it's important that researchers and cities think about this as personal data, as highly sensitive data, and that they treat it that way, especially if they want to maintain the trust of the companies that they're working with and the citizens that they serve. So as tempting as it is to sort of have all this data and say, this is amazing, we've never had data like this before, let's put it in a big database, we'll give it to all the researchers, we'll give it to all the planners, we should definitely move with a little bit more caution than that. And I think that that's created a lot of tension. In fact, there's a lawsuit right now between the city of LA and Uber around this exact issue. So we have to get that right. This is just a little bit about some of the service that we provide. We actually come in and we take the MBS data that cities are getting access to, and we perform a full-scale audit of every single operator's data. And then for operators that have really high quality data and a track record around it, we come in, we actually certify their data feeds so that cities know that they can trust it. So I think that it just shows me that there's a lot of space for independent companies like ours to help create that trust and to help make sure that, you know, in addition to open source standards, we have good high quality data that cities are getting access to. And the nice thing is this creates really strong incentives for the operators to actually provide good data, because it turns into a competitive thing, right? If they know that by providing higher quality data than one of their competitors, they can look good and get a special certification stamp, they'll actually start competing around it. And so we've seen this, we've seen companies like Bird, Lime, and Bolt strive to have the best data available to cities, which is a complete inversion of what happened in the days of ride hailing, where companies were warring to keep their data locked up because they were worried that their competitor would, you know, have even less data available to the city. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about sort of the top rung of the pyramid around the regulations that cities put in place. And again, it's really important that regulations are driven and informed by the data. So if you make a rule up, but you can't actually assess whether that rule is being followed using this data, it's probably not a good rule. If you can't enforce it using this data, you're probably not going to get compliance. So cities have to be careful about, you know, what are the types of regulations that they can use that will actually be informed by data. And it's not always the same tools that they're used to working with. So an example of that is fleet caps. Almost every city that we work with has a cap on the number of vehicles that can be in service at any given time. And the purpose of this is just to make sure that we don't end up with something like, you know, China, where you have like these giant literal piles of bikes all over the place. You know, I think every city is choosing their caps differently. And they're trying to, you know, ultimately make sure that these services are not overwhelming the system. However, there needs to be some like attention on the other side as well, because if you come in and say, oh, you know, we're going to have a 100 vehicle cap, that doesn't actually, it's like impossible for any company to be profitable operating with a 100 vehicle cap, right? Because they still have to hire all this sort of like people to manage that. And if it's only 100 vehicles, they're probably not going to stay in the city. So we have seen that. We've seen operators who pull out of a city if the vehicle cap is too aggressively low. And then of course, it's not just the operators that get harmed by that. It's if I am trying to go somewhere and I can't find a scooter because there's only like 100 or 500 available, then I'm probably not going to start relying on that as mode of transportation. So one of the things that's really interesting is that some cities are starting to play with not just a fixed vehicle cap, but one that's actually driven by performance metrics. So you can see here, this is a fake company called Payo that we invented. And some of the stats that cities look at are like the number of trips that happen per day. And then a really key one is the number of trips per vehicle per day, right? So if you see a whole bunch of trips per vehicle per day, that tells you two things. One, there's a lot of demand. So that's a good sign. Maybe there should be more vehicles. And it also tells you that because they're, you know, constantly being used, they're not going to be sort of left forever on the sidewalk and turn into like piles of unused scooters, right? So a high trips per vehicle per day stat is a positive sort of healthy thing. And what some cities are doing is they're saying, okay, well, if you can have, you know, at least, let's say 6 trips per day, we'll actually increase your cap. And if we see that number fall, we're going to decrease your cap, right? And so that number can be flexible, right? And it can even start to respond to things like maybe the number of scooters that's optimal in the winter is not the same as the number of scooters that's optimal in the summer. And it even starts to create like exciting incentives where, like, let's say that, you know, the number of trips per vehicle per day goes down in the winter. Well, maybe there's an operator that can figure out how to make a scooter with like a windshield and a roof, and then their trips per vehicle per day goes up, and then they actually get more scooters, and then, you know, they're kicking all their competitors' butts. So it's kind of a cool way to not just regulate, but to create incentives that drive the kind of innovation that cities want to see. And the other thing I like about it is it avoids a monopoly. I don't think anybody wants to see a single company that sort of gobbles up the whole space and then tells cities what's what. It's not good for cities because they lose a lot of leverage. And I also think it just sort of, I find it really exciting that there's all these companies who are experimenting with, like, should it have a seat? Should it have pedals? Maybe it can carry 2 people. Maybe it's going to have the windshield or whatever. So I think a monopoly would sort of stifle that. And what's cool about the cap is that cities can manage it in a way where, you know, they can sort of rotate different operators in and out of service based on whether they're performing well. Another cool regulation that we've seen is designated parking zones. So probably the #1 complaint that cities hear is going to be around scooters parked in inappropriate locations. And of course, you can try to get, you know, the operators to move the scooters when they're blocking, or you can try to get citizens to, like, you know, get penalized if they park it in the middle of the sidewalk. But the more carrot-driven approach is to just give them a place to park it. So this might be Austin, I'm not sure. But several cities have started creating these designated parking zones. What's really cool is it's, you know, it's a sort of dumb parking area. All it really is like some spray paint and then some data that shows up in the app. So anybody that's using the app can see this as a designated parking zone. The operators can even start to create like incentives, like maybe it's a little bit cheaper, you get some extra credit if you park in these zones. I think it's really, really cool. One of the things I love about it, and you can see it in this picture, is there's also an opportunity to create daylighting around intersections. It's pretty easy to see through a little field of scooters. So if there was a giant SUV here, it'd be harder to cross the street. So that's kind of a win-win, which I love. And again, you know, tying this back to data so that cities can actually collect data on how many of the scooters are parked in these designated areas. Caveat to that is that GPS is not always going to be accurate enough to assess whether a scooter is parked like here or here. So that's just something that cities have to be aware of. If their goal is to measure compliance, they need to use a coarser filter than that. However, I can't really imagine that somebody is going to park a scooter here instead of here unless this area is full. So around equity, there's been some interesting innovation. I think Portland has done a lot of really interesting things around managing for equity. So I mentioned the target deployment areas. What a lot of our cities are doing is they're taking a geofence essentially, and it could even be a geofence that changes depending on how things are performing. And then they're setting up deployment targets. So they're saying, you know, for example, East Portland is a geofence in Portland's permitting program. And then there needs to be, you know, a certain number of vehicles or a certain percentage of the fleet that is deployed there each morning. One of the things, though, that I think is really important is that cities are not just looking at deployment targets, but they're actually looking at the number of trips happening. You know, just putting the scooters out there is not actually achieving your goal. Your goal is to get people using them. And so, you know, if you're seeing like operators just kind of dump a bunch of scooters in East Portland to meet their equity requirements, that's not great alignment because the citizens are not getting a good service. And then in addition, the operators are not making any money because no one's using them. And so that's going to create some problems. So cities should be paying attention to the number of trips that are happening and sort of playing with these numbers to try to make it work. Equity pricing is another interesting one. So Portland has in their new permitting program a different fee structure. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a second when I talk about fees. And then, as I mentioned, you know, really paying attention to outcomes. So making sure that you're using data to constantly reevaluate and make sure that the goal that you have, which is, you know, equitable utilization of these services and equitable access to these services, is actually being met. So the fees. this is really interesting. There's been a big shift in the past, I would say, year and a half, and I think Portland, led this shift from big flat program fees like this one that Oakland had, and I think they might be dropping this in their new version, $30,000 just to sort of get any number of vehicles permitted. That is how cities were doing things initially, and then the problem is, if you have a smaller company that's going to deploy a smaller fleet, it's a negative incentive for them. Conversely, it's probably really easy for a big company to do. But then it also removes any sort of skin in the game for operators as they grow. And it avoids a situation where cities can continually use fees to create incentives, right? So one of the things that we really recommend to cities is that they move away from big program fees and move towards fees that scale with the number of vehicles and or the actual usage of those vehicles. And we're seeing this more and more. Almost every city at this point has got a per vehicle permit fee. And then an increasing number of cities, starting with Portland, have a usage fee. So Portland was the first city to do this. They had 25 cents per trip that the operators had to pay them just in order to do business. And Portland actually earmarked this money to go back into the bike infrastructure, which I think is really cool. Like you could have a substantial amount of money for new bike lanes and bike parking, and how often does that happen? Portland actually increased this fee in its most recent permitting program, the one that we're currently in. And as I said, they actually made it scale depending on which parts of town you're talking about. So downtown, there's sort of a lot of demand for these services, and there's a lot of density, and there's a lot of money, and it's pretty easy for scooter companies to deploy scooters and make money. So Portland's actually charging a higher fee there. And then in other parts of town where it might be more challenging to make money, Portland's charging I think in some cases, no fee, to just try to not just create the incentives, but sort of balance the profitability so that you get more equitable distribution of these scooters. I think that's really cool, and I'm excited to see more experimentation around that. And then you can create incentives around anything using your pricing, right? So not just equity, but maybe, again, Portland created some incentives in their permitting program around having adaptive vehicles. You can imagine that maybe the fees go down a little bit in the winter to try to make sure that you have a service that is year-round. So I think this is really exciting and an area of innovation for cities right now. No matter what you do, though, you want to make sure that you have transparency around pricing, because anytime there's a surprise for someone running a business, that's going to be really hard. And then I think also having transparency around how you plan to spend the money, because ideally we'd like to see it going back into the infrastructure itself. I think that's a big opportunity for cities. Not only do you get money for the infrastructure, but you get a little bit more skin in the game for the operator, because they're paying all these fees, but those fees are actually creating infrastructure that helps create demand for their services. So that's a powerful alignment there, and I think cities are wise when they earmark the money to go back into the infrastructure. So I'll just close by saying that I think the best programs are really about fostering this public-private collaboration. They're built on trust and respect. And I think data plays a key role in enabling that kind of trust and respect, but this is what we're shooting for in our micromobility programs. And I will open it up for questions. Okay, we got plenty of time for questions, so I'm just gonna start at the front of the room and work my way back. All right, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I'm interested in the fleet caps.
Mm-hmm.
And when you mentioned one of the problems being mounds of bikes in China.
Yeah.
Before you said that, I was thinking, oh, maybe you were going to say, if we don't have caps, look at what has happened with cars being parked everywhere all over our streets.
For sure.
But you mentioned mounds of bikes in China, and I'm not familiar with that problem. I'm wondering, is that a real problem? And do you think that the fleet caps are a challenge to getting more scooters and micromobility devices on the street?
Yeah, I mean, both, honestly. I definitely think I see this a lot. This kind of like, there's a double standard between like how we're regulating bikes and scooters and how we're regulating cars. And frankly, the main reason for that double standard is that we can't regulate cars like that. I'm sure a lot of cities would love to cap the number of single occupancy vehicles, but politically that's not viable. There's also not, there's no data, there's no technology apparatus where they could do that. So it is a double standard. That's one way to think of it. It's a valid way to think of it. It's also true, though, that cities are thinking about this need for control in terms of what might happen in the future. So they are thinking about things like autonomous vehicles, where they probably would have a cap on the number of autonomous vehicles, right? So as much as, I would love to just see scooters everywhere, I think it's important that we're building a system that kind of gives cities the tools they need for the future. That said, I do think in a lot of cases the caps are way too low, and that there's just kind of cities might be losing sight of like the goals. That's why it's so important to set them out so that citizens can sort of say, hey, wasn't the goal here to decrease congestion and keep safe streets, and like, are we really is increasing the cap really going to jeopardize those goals? So I think we're starting to see that, and again, I think the most exciting trend is around dynamic caps, because frankly, like if you're only reevaluating your permit program once a year, which is really often for cities, right? They're used to doing like multi-year exclusives. So they're now doing things once a year, which feels crazy fast. But even at once a year, if you're only increasing the cap once a year, it's going to take a long time to get there. And then we've seen cities that are doing dynamic caps get to much higher fleet sizes really quickly without a lot of pain. So Austin, I think, is a city that's really leading here. They have more vehicles, certainly per capita, than any other city in the country. And they have way more trips than any other city as well. So yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
We have a question from online.
Yeah.
One of the big selling points of scooters was last mile connection. Are cities experimenting with trying to focus scooters near important transit stops?
Yeah. So I've seen a range of approaches there. I've seen cities that create parking zones near transit, and sometimes I've even seen cities that create pricing incentives. So just as I mentioned, Portland has a pricing incentive for placing scooters in East Portland. I've seen cities that create geofences around like light rail stops and then make it cheaper for scooters that are deployed there. So that's an interesting one. And then I think a lot of cities are just sort of studying the data and trying to understand how it fits into transit utilization.
I'm going to give a two-piece question. The first piece is with data privacy.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a data or tech-driven company that's proven yet that it can be private data at all. Nobody,
Yeah.
even the NSA and and the FBI and CIA, all have been compromised.
Yeah.
So the other part of that question is, well, the first part is how do we ensure users that their data will be anonymized?
Yeah.
B, is it possible to design a system where the user and the vehicle are not connected digitally at all? Like instead of having to use your app, which has all your UUID and the vehicle UUID, so together privacy over tokens or coins that you could buy through cash, and therefore there's no trace.
Yeah. So did you still have the location trace? I think is the real thorny issue there.
Location trace is not so much a problem.
It is though. It really is.
Okay, but I'm thinking of like the individual user, because you don't necessarily want to be connected personally to that trip you made.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, when I talk to most people who are not in the field that we're in, that's the thing why they won't use them, because they don't want Lyft or not Lyft, but Bolt or Bird or Lime to know that they're using it.
Right.
They say I would use it if I knew that the company didn't know that I was using it.
Interesting.
But I'll let them know where I went, but I don't want them to know it was me that went there.
Right. So it sounds like there's like the kinds of concerns you're thinking about are not just concerns of whether the city has the data, but whether the operator has the data. Is that?
Yeah, because when you get in your car, it's always been you go wherever you want.
Right.
And nobody knows.
Right.
Right. And so in America, we have this understanding that we go where we want.
Right.
And the reason why we use our car.
Yeah.
Because we don't have to prove where we are and where we don't.
Yeah, no, I think that's a real concern. And it's something that cities have to be really thoughtful about. Like the last thing we would want, equity is at the base of that pyramid, right? So we have to think about privacy as an equity issue. If somebody is worried about being tracked by the government or by a corporation, they might not get on this scooter. They might not use that service. And so the bar is pretty high for cities to show that it's a safe service. I think about the fact that, if you get on a bike and you get pulled over by a cop, it's really hard to resist search and seizure. If you're in a car, you actually do have some rights there. They're not always followed, but you do have some recourse. And so if you're worried about that, if you're worried about like police enforcement, like targeting, you might not choose to be on a bike for that reason, right?
I don't think it's
So we don't
not
want to create the
police-
data equivalent of that.
I don't think it's police targeting, it's more commercial targeting.
Yeah, so I was just
Now-
making an analogy
Yeah,
there.
okay, I think that
Yep.
one is too extreme, but the real thing people are really worried about is I want to get home and then have my email box inundated
Right.
with ads from a type of business that I went to or next to, right?
Yeah.
Like, all of a sudden you want all Mary's Club sending you all kinds of promotional stuff. If you're from a more conservative family, when you went actually to US Outdoor Store.
Yeah. So I mean, cities have an opportunity there because they have the ability to regulate these companies. They do have the ability to say what does and doesn't get collected, what doesn't get stored, what does and doesn't get shared. I haven't seen cities doing this yet, but you do have at the federal level some privacy legislation that could be happening. And of course, in Europe, you do have GDPR. So I talk a lot to cities and say, hey, what would it look like to have sort of GDPR for cities? So, yeah.
Do you have any insights into the life cycle of scooters and long-term sustainability?
Mm.
It's Gabby's understanding that the actual infrastructure only lasts around a year.
Mhm.
How are cities and companies preparing to deal with waste and recycling of their vehicles, if at all?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think there's a couple of things that you can do. First of all, just using the data that cities get via MDS, they can see, how long vehicles are in service, how often they're being pulled for service, stuff like that. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to that, which is that sometimes vehicles might be going out of service and then pop up in a different city, so they're not in the river or whatever. And then I think Portland is requiring operators to do life cycle analysis on all their scooters in the current permit period. So that's one way to approach it. Just get better data and maybe create incentives around companies to drive up the length of, that their product lasts. I think operators are already starting to kind of move in that direction on their own, just for business model reasons. Like initially, they weren't really thinking about profitability. They're just like, dump scooters on the ground and you have to do it faster than your competition. And so you're not really worried about whether the scooter lasts 6 months or whatever, but that's changing pretty rapidly. So what's interesting is that cities actually have a role to play there, which is the higher the price of those scooters, the more incentive there is for the companies to actually make sure that they're maintainable and that they last and that they're recovered. So cities can increase the incentives that operators have to basically try to maximize the value of each scooter instead of creating incentives that kind of encourage the more like blitzkrieg approach where you just dump a whole bunch of scooters on the ground. It's a great question though. Yes?
So it seems like one of the problems that scooters can solve is congestion. And I'm curious, where do you see scooters taking trips away from cars from? Because you showed a picture of a highway.
Yeah.
If somebody drives here from Troutdale, I don't know if they would take a scooter from Troutdale.
Probably
They
not.
can't, right?
Yeah.
Because the service doesn't go that far.
Yeah.
So what types of trips are we talking about?
Yeah, so Portland has a great data on this. Best data I've seen, I think, is their survey data from the last pilot program. And it was really interesting. Like, it actually, a lot of the trips were ride-hailing trips. So they asked, questions about what you used for your last trip that you used a scooter for if the scooter wasn't available. So ride-hailing was a big one. Sometimes transit, but not a whole lot. And then sometimes single occupancy vehicle trips, but probably not like a 5-10 mile trip from Gresham or whatever, right? It is interesting, again, like connectivity to mass transit does make some of those mass transit options more viable in some cases. So personally, like I don't live close enough to a MAX station that I would take MAX, but if I could reliably get a scooter to the MAX, I probably would do it, especially if my transit fare was cheaper when I did that. So, yeah. Yes.
Is there any data on where these scooters are being charged? Like who, the locations of the juicers?
That's a fantastic question. I've never seen that data. The closest I've seen is that Portland, again, is requiring operators to share VMT data, vehicle miles traveled, for the juicers or the people that pick up the scooters, because they're mostly driving cars. So that's another sort of hidden cost or hidden carbon cost to these services that, there really isn't a lot of data on, other than Portland requiring that VMT data to be shared. But that's not part of the MDS standard, and largely it's kind of like on the sidelines right now.
I have a follow-up to that
Yeah,
question.
sure.
And kind of similar question about like where individual juicers are. Is there any collection of like where the warehouses, like I feel like I've seen a lot of either like small businesses open up they have open space that they've allowed these companies to come in and like basically rent to use warehouse spaces.
Yeah.
So I'd just be curious if you know anything about that data in addition to the juicers, or if that's being observed or tracked by the cities at all, because I think it's fascinating.
It's not being tracked with the standard MDS, but I'm sure there are cities, I don't know whether Portland's requiring that data. I'm sure there are cities that are requiring it. Yeah. But like, to be frank, like, I don't think cities are going to get good, consistent data unless it's in the standard. So these are the kinds of things that really do need to become part of the standard if cities are going to start tracking them. Yeah.
Do you believe that the pilot program in Portland was successful because of the culture here, or because the city was organized and responsible with implementation?
Wow. Well, I mean, obviously I'm going to say both. I think Portland certainly has like more infrastructure, culture, awareness, et cetera, that I think does help micromobility get off to a good start. And I've seen cities like Dallas, Texas, that it's challenging you can't just throw a bunch of bikes there, right? Like, there is infrastructure you need, and there's education that you need, both of the road users and people around. So I think that's helped Portland. I think Portland also has been very thoughtful about the kinds of regulations that they craft, and they've been remarkably open to working with operators. The one thing I haven't seen that I wish I saw was the same openness around Bikeshare. My understanding is that they have a contractual obligation that prevents that, but we don't have electric Bikeshare in Portland, and a lot of cities do. And I think electric Bikeshare would be a fantastic addition here. So I think Portland has some early successes with scooters, and hopefully they're going to take some of those learnings and apply them to a future electric Bikeshare program. All that said, I think Portland could probably 5 or 10x the number of bikes and scooters on the ground without a whole lot of problems. So I would love to see just like more. My neighborhood almost never has scooters. It's part of the service area, but never see it. Yeah.
So that last point brings up kind of the question I was thinking about, and the thought is about who's best provides the services for scooters, about kind of location, how many to have, where to put in the city. So a lot of the examples were the city using the data to try to manage where the scooters are, what types of scooters there are, and how many there are. We talked about the dynamic caps and the geofencing. So the question is, who's best positioned to do that scooter operation stuff? Or where are the operators best positioned versus the city? And then a deeper question, one level below that is, so we talked about monopolies, but does the city solely get to decide this? Because the city has their interest.
Right.
And the city is not the same as the citizens, the operators. So Is the city the sole one to decide what they get to do and what they don't get to do? So, but the main one is, who's best to do these?
Yeah, I mean, the former question really sounds like you're describing what we do. Like we go in to cities where they have, a set of regulations and they've asked for the data, but they don't necessarily have like tools to turn that data into, is this regulation being followed? And is this regulation successful at achieving the outcome that I have in mind? And a lot of times, cities need to be able to sort of move quickly and like try different things, whether it's measuring things in different ways or creating different incentives. So that's really where our platform, that's why we exist. The answer to your sort of deeper question, I don't know. I mean, like right now, cities have almost all of the power, and there isn't yet like a political constituency of like scooter users who are saying to cities like, hey, we'd love to see more scooters, or hey, the prices are too high. Maybe we'll see that emerge in the future.
Yeah, we have to unfortunately cut it off because there's a class that comes in here next. So, so before we thank William for the interesting, insightful presentation, next week's seminar is Dongo Chang from the city of Seattle, going to come down and tell us all the interesting things they're doing in Seattle. So let's give William a round of applause. And, yeah, I mentioned the class does come in 10 minutes, and so we kind of have to move out. We can take our conversations out into the lobby there.